A desert holiday, let's pack the drag away. You take the lunch and tea, I'll take the ecstasy. Fuck off, you silly queer, I'm getting out of here. A desert holiday, hip 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 hooray. I chose the Adventures of Priscilla, Queen of the Desert, because 1994 was wonderful. It was written and directed by Stephan Elliott and costumed by Tim Chappell, and he won the Academy Award for Best Costume Design with Lizzie Gardner. Released 10th of August 94, and like a month later in Australia, because even Australian movies don't have the same release date as they do in the US, because life sucks. Just to give you a quick background about 1994 in Australia, our Prime Minister was Paul Keating. The West Coast Eagles had defeated Geelong in the AFL.
So Donna should be happy if she goes for West Coast.
Oh no, that's not my
Are you
thing.
a Dockers fan?
It's not my thing. I abstain from the Australian delusion. Christopher Skase had been arrested in Spain and nothing came of it. And a month later, June wins the Melbourne Cup. And the last bit is the Human Rights Sexual Conduct Bill for legalising sexual activity between adults in private had been passed. So that's Australia in 1994.
Ahead of us, by the way, in the US. So.
Side note, have any of you guys seen the best of Paul Keating insults in Parliament?
Oh no, but I now must.
To?
Because he was very
so
witty. He was too smart to be a politician. That was his problem. Tick accepts a job to perform at a casino in Alice Springs. He's joined by Bernadette, a trans woman who's recently lost a 25-year-old partner when he slipped in the bathroom while dyeing his hair. And Adam, a flamboyant, always-on performer. They are joined by Bob, an outback mechanic in a bus named Priscilla, which was paid for by Adam manipulating his mother. Anyway, along the way, they see the beauty and horrors of Australia and a few twists along the way. That being Tick was married, Tick being great friends with his wife, and that his wife is lesbian. And they have a son, although this is hinted at the beginning, but when I first watched it, I did not pick up on that at all. But I think I was about 10. It is a wonderful film. It is one of my... it is my favourite Australian film. It is one of the prettiest things that you will ever see, that because drag is such a city art and culture, if that makes sense. You won't... I don't think drag would ever pop up randomly in a country town. It might. Apparently Northern Territory has a massive drag scene, but that might be because they went to Alice Springs. It's just this really artificial beauty with the natural beauty of Australia and all this other stuff that comes up, like aging in relationships and family and homophobia, masculinity. And what did everyone think of it?
It was great, as always. It's great.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean...
Yep, I loved it. It was great.
It's fun. I mean, it's absolutely fun. It's campy, it's silly, but it's also touching. It hits real issues, real emotions. It's surprisingly deep for such a, what seems like a silly, flamboyant movie. I mean, I remember watching this back when it first came out, and I was not a little kid. I was out, and everyone. I mean, I went with like a gay youth group to see it, and we were back our LGBT, but back then we just say gay. and everyone was just like, "This is fabulous," Funny side note, the second time I saw it was a couple of years later at an LGBT Pride Week celebration. They had it outdoors on Boston Common, and it was shown for anyone. And because of that, they had to cut out anything remotely controversial, which presumably would be most of the movie. But I mean, so all the best scenes were completely cut out, which sucked, including the amazing ping pong ball scene.
Segues me to my next point, because that's one of the big criticisms about it, and quite a few people attached to the film have said essentially, well, she's not meant to portray every Filipino woman in the same way that 3 drag performers from Sydney are not meant to portray every single man
but yet.
in Australia.
But
in a film in a film about breaking down stereotypes, it was
Right.
a particularly ugly stereotype.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah,
yet it-
and
Yet it is
it's a
hysterical.
musical, and you can buy pink ping pong balls. And on that, the Conversation Hour, the ABC Melbourne version, had an interview with Tim Chappelle, and I'll quote him directly when they brought up the ping pong balls, and he said, quote, "It was never culturally appropriate ever at any time in neither the film or the musical, and that's why it must stay, because there is something in Priscilla to offend everybody. We made sure of it." Which
Yeah,
I really like.
It is offensive. It's one of those scenes, it's like ridiculously offensive, but it's probably the most memorable scene in the movie. As awful as it is,
yeah.
you know. It's like you feel guilty laughing, but you have to laugh. Like,
It's hard
You
not
know,
to, yeah.
I think this movie is the most diverse out of all of the movies, though, that we've chosen. All of the movies are very, very white, like incredibly white.
right.
It's because Priscilla has the scene with the Aboriginals
Right.
with their corroboree, and that's the only reason why it's not incredibly white, and it's still really white. But yeah.
I really like that scene because it's like the best reception they get out of all the performances they give throughout.
Right.
Like they try a few pubs and they get pretty lackluster reception. Even the final performance they give, the whole point of the journey to this hotel that Tick's wife is managing, it's just this very tepid kind of applause.
Right.
But
Everyone.
when they're with the indigenous people, it's like this massive celebration. Everyone's dancing, everyone's joining in. Their savior runs in and gets dressed up and is performing. So it's like these two kind of marginalized groups who have found each other out in the middle of nowhere. That's actually where the most life and the most performance and the most love kind of flourishes.
Because they appreciate it. They appreciate understanding being different. And, you know, I liked it.
I also love the relationship between Tick and Bernadette. Like, even though it's a very silly and irreverent kind of script a lot of the time, they're making fun of everything and all that. But that relationship I thought was really deep, and the conversations they were having, and the history, like where Tick reveals that he was married in a past life, that he gets really choked up and says, "I'm sorry I didn't tell you, but I'm not sorry you came." Like there's a really moving performance in those two leads, I thought, and there's a lot of real human emotion and history embedded into those performances.
Right. Well, you get all his guilt from, you know, his guilt of having done this and not talking about it, and you know.
And they're sort of an older generation of drag queens, and they're sort of taking this other guy under their wing and kind of fostering him, trying to teach him how the world works and toughen him up. So I really like that dichotomy of the different generations.
Because one of the points that I put down was like this idea of community, and you see it from the very beginning when Priscilla embarks versus that coast to coast run. Like Priscilla is just three drag queens in a bus, and she gets a full send off, and this woman who's running coast to coast with a weird thing on her back, it's like two people.
What was that?
And it's all very staged.
That was so weird.
I forgot that was from the beginning of the movie. I was like, "Where is what?"
Until she,
every time I saw her again, I was like,
until she like runs past them. Yeah, it's
so
Twice.
good. But I also love that she did keep coming back occasionally.
Right.
And, like you did see her, and then every time they're like, "Hello," and she's like, "I don't care who you are. I'm busy." With Bernadette, I loved their relationship, and it definitely stemmed because they both have been in the industry for a very long time and have known each other for a very long time, so you can see that trust between them.
Right. Well, I think you get that, you know, I mean, I'm not a queen in any sense, but I think that when you've got an older generation of gay men who've lived through a lot together, there's a sort of sisterhood, you know, like my best friend, Michael, we call each other sisters, you know, and we mean that because we feel like sisters. And I think that that's what you got with them because they've been through a lot. I mean, look, when she says, you know, I've learned how to fight because I've had to. You know, that's an important bit. I mean, it's interesting because the youngest character gets, I mean, in many ways, the least of a story, you know, except they do get one of the most important ones, which is the bashing scene, which, you know, shows the foolishness and, you know, and the frivolity, but also the real danger in their lives from day to day. You know, I mean, that was one of the things that I'm glad that
scene was as well, it's the intergenerational thing, like, because Tick and Bernadette's generation had set up a community that meant that Adam's generation never had to see that or feel that way or be made to learn how to fight.
But to be honest, in 1994, she would have. I mean, I'm sorry, in 1994, you could get beaten up walking down the street. I mean, even in Sydney or Boston or even New York, and frankly, even today, I mean, that's still a danger out there, and it's something that particularly trans people have to deal with, you know. And I mean, you can argue which, if any of these three characters are truly trans, because I mean, you know, certainly the other two don't seem it as much, you know. But
Bernadette is trans, though, right, because they say she's taking hormones.
Exactly. The other two are drag queens, and there is sort of that whole difference, too. And that's, in fact, a debate in LGBT community over whether drag is real trans or if it makes fun of women or trans people or if it's bad. And I don't want to get into that because that's long and complicated. But, I mean, there is, whether you're trans or just doing drag, there's a danger every time you step out of the house. You could not make it home again. And, you know, that's something that my generation of gay men had to live through as well. Not as much as the trans people, though, because, you know, it's on your face, you know, quite literally with the makeup and everything else. But, you know, we can sometimes hide, although some of us can't. And I think that's something that this generation, when you talk about this, I mean, you would think that she would have understood the danger that she was putting herself into, or he, or whichever, you know, in this scene. But yet, you know, there is the foolishness, and you add alcohol and all that, and I'm glad that scene was in there.
I think we are meant to think that Adam has lived a more sheltered experience.
Right. Yeah.
He's been kind of a part of Sydney where he hasn't been exposed to this. I mean, Sydney, yes, definitely that stuff would happen, but
they
contrast with these very small outback towns, it's going to be much more severe.
In the movie,
and I think that.
No, in the movie they actually say, I think it's Anthony says that in a way Sydney's protected them. So as much as it's kept them in, but it's also kept other things out. So
yeah, that's what I was going to say. And I think that adds the kind of importance of this expedition. Initially, it was just about this fun romp. They were going to get away from their lives. They were going to go up and do this show, get their heads right. But the fact that they're having to confront these really backwards and these really hostile attitudes that are still out there, it's more about like leaving the kind of safety of places like the city and saying, no, we're actually here. We're part of this world. We're going to show that we exist. We're not invisible. We can't be, shunted aside. And I think the visual, the visual kind of grammar of the movie is so powerful. The colors of the sprawling red landscape and just the multicolored costumes against, speeding against that or up on a rock and all that. It's so it's so like mesmerizing and beautiful, especially compared to like the way that the pubs are kind of shot are very dank and dark and shadowy and dull and boring. And when that color is added, it just adds so much life. So it's kind of adding this, it's the idea of this spectrum, that this whole spectrum to humanity, but also about saying, we're here, we're not going to be afraid, and you're just going to have to accept this.
Well, I've had a look around, and I think we can safely assume that I now know less about motors than I did when I first lifted up that bonnety thing.
Now what?
Let's just not think about it for the moment and eat brekkie, shall we?
Oh, that's a novel idea. Let's stuff ourselves to death. Imagine the headlines. Whales beach themselves in the outback. Mystery boomsticks dead in drag.
Well, there's no point in walking back. The only life I saw for the last 1,000,000 miles were the hypnotised bunnies. Most of them are now wedged in the tyres.
Well, somebody will drive past for sure. We'll keep the fire burning.
Yes, and toast marshmallows and chill champagne for when they arrive. What if they don't drive past?
Look, you're not helping here. Steep your hormones.
Hell, why don't we stick to the main road?
What difference does it make now?
You got us into this, Anthony Belrose. And I suggest you start thinking about how to get us back. Or I don't fancy your chances of ever trying to be a husband again. Jesus, what are we going to do?
We're going to start off with a little facelift. Nothing like a new frock to brighten up your day.
And in comes someone wearing a dress made out of thongs, which was fabulous. I mean, a dress full of bright, colorful thongs is just, or flip-flops, a lot of people in America would call them, is just hysterical.
I mean, this had to win the Oscar for best costume.
Right, absolutely.
At the Oscars.
It was actually up against two period pieces, so when I looked at it, I was
hard.
like, that they could have gone the conservative route. Because that kind of brings me on to one thing I had to ask you all, but I'm going to go first. Which was your favorite costume? Because I'm just going to say mine first so no one else gets in. Okay. Mine was definitely the Guy Pearce in the silver costume, lip-syncing to La Traviata, the opera, on the bass and the silver. Yeah. The makeup and everything.
Yes.
I was worried for him. I thought it was going to rip him off this. There was too much costume that the wind was going to rip him into the sky.
You need to listen to the History Hour, History Hour. That's BBC, the Conversation Hour, because they talk about that. Because the day that they filmed it, there was absolutely no wind, and it got to the point where they had to film it.
Fake it.
And Tim Chappell, because the stunt coordinators. The length of the train, they said you need to cut this down significantly because it's long enough where it's going to get caught in the wheels and we might accidentally kill Guy Pearce. You need to snip it. And he was about to take his scissors to it, and the wind picked up, and they're like, we can film. So it was a miracle. If there's a God, thank you. That wind was well deserved.
In the montage, I love the lizard costumes and the makeup they have for it, I think is incredible.
Mm-hmm.
So that's my favorite.
I think the thong dress was trashy fun, but I think if I had to pick a favorite, the 3 matching ostrich outfits. When they're wearing the ostrich heads. Yeah, or emus, when they're wearing them on their heads and they're wearing the dress is the body of it, that was fabulous. That was in that montage at the end as well with the lizards.
What were the other animals they dressed as?
Wasn't there some catty kind of thing?
They did a Gumnut Baby.
Lion.
They had the little golden wattle outfit. They had the Sydney Opera House,
which was cool.
Oh yeah.
That was epic.
They had the 70s the really halter top ones? One. Yeah, the really flared ones where their shoes were part of the outfit. Their feet were inside of it.
Yeah, see, that's enough. Everyone needs to listen to the Conversation Hour, just like this episode, because he talks about that, because they lost funding twice. So his background was during his Bachelor of Arts in fashion design. He was making costumes for drag queens on the side. And as he says, it was mock de croc. So it was, something for very little money. So that's why things like the thong dress existed.
Right. That cost her $10 or something. Right, it was cheap. I remember.
Yeah.
But that halter neck one, because they lost funding twice, it meant that he had so much time to gestate on these costumes. So originally it was going to be an afro and a halter top and some flares. And then he was then I put a flower behind their hair, and then there was tons of flowers. And I'm like, why don't I do an afro full of flowers? And then they originally had shoes, but I wanted them really flared. So then I kind of attached it to the shoes, and then I realized they didn't need shoes at all. So it was kind of the nice thing about people bailing on that film so many times is that these costumes are fantastic.
If that's probably going to be one of the things that most people will take from it, was just the fabulous outfits. I will say one of the things that I also thought was interesting is that, this movie was made in 1994, right in the middle of the AIDS epidemic, the year before the antiretroviral cocktail that ended up slowing down the deaths massively. And most movies in this era, at least LGBT-themed ones, have to talk about HIV/AIDS because, it just was so overwhelming in life. It was just everywhere. And it's interesting that the movie starts with a death, like so many of these movies, but it was actually that the lover fell in a bathtub, which I thought was an interesting. We didn't want to make it an AIDS death, but it was.
With this as well, though, in Australia, the AIDS epidemic was nowhere near as prevalent as in America. In Australia, it wasn't as bad, thankfully, because people got on top of it quite early when it got here.
Yes, but it was still.
It's still
incredibly
horrific,
devastating. But it did devastate the Sydney and Melbourne gay community, and it was only because of grassroots organisations there was a Sydney free clinic that really, they were in like the late 80s, and that's what you see in Adam's bag. He has a thing of condoms, like, because they were just like, you wrap it. And this was the late 80s.
You couldn't go to a bar.
Mid-80s, we got needle exchanges, 85 dog, like, blood donation screens. But the really interesting thing is, like, the AIDS fuckers go home when they painted that on the bus.
That would have happened.
So I think Duncan has mentioned before the Grim Reaper ad, the bowling ad.
Yeah.
So that came out in 1987, and I was reading an interview with one of the women that was attached to it, and she said the good thing is it stopped a lot of high-risk behavior, but the other problem is for the straight community, they actually saw not the Grim Reaper as the AIDS virus. Well, it was an AIDS virus at the time, like HIV now. They saw that as gay people, so it unfortunately put this stigma on the gay community that they weren't prepared for.
Well, I mean, I think one of the things you learned from that era was that anything you did would backfire, because if people wanted to be bigoted and see bad messages, they were going to. I mean, there was, after, all the visibility of the AIDS activist movement and just the people dying and everything but all that, there was a huge backlash in America. There was a wave of bashing that happened after it. So, I mean, there was nothing you could do to help people that didn't have a backlash. And that's in many ways true of almost any civil rights movement throughout history. As people move forward, there's always a blowback, unfortunately.
One connection that I found to Wake in Fright was that the town where this happens, where they get the graffiti on the bus, is Broken Hill, which is where they shot Wake in Fright. It's the same town. Which I thought was interesting because Wake in Fright is all about this kind of toxic masculinity that the protagonist gets sucked into. And then in this film, it's sort of about actually going out into these places and confronting it from the other side. And it's this condemnation of this kind of attitude or behavior, that it is toxic and it leads to stagnation and fear, and that their journey is kind of making people, even though it seems funny and silly, making people laugh is actually kind of the best antidote, and making them see you as a real person is the best antidote to these kinds of attitudes. Yeah, and I can tell you, in the middle of the AIDS crisis, for all the awful horrors that people saw, we laughed a lot. I mean, we as activists, we went out clubbing and dancing and partying hard and having lots of sex and laughing and telling jokes and dark humor. There was a lot of dark humor, but you have to laugh. That's the only way. That's how you deal with horror, I think. And to me, it's a nice antidote to Wake in Fright, because Wake in Fright is like this world of entrapment, and Priscilla is all about like breaking out of these shackles and creating a new world. And it's this journey is like this journey into the heart of, what is Australia? What's actually out there? What's actually beyond the sort of safety of the city? And it's hopeful because it's like, Australia, it's not just this frozen kind of conservative nostalgia, or it's not just this Wake in Fright kind of haunted, empty, evil place, but it is capable of transformation. We're not this static thing, that we can actually change and evolve and like meet each other out in the wilderness. As long as there's ping pong balls.
Bob. I just, like everything you said, I completely agree with.
Enough sequence can save anyone.
There you go. That if there's any message to take from this whole podcast.
And Bill Hunter, the Ocker male, opening up and finding himself. That's another hopeful little aspect of this movie.
Well, he even mentions like very quickly, like he saw Les Girls when he was in Sydney as a young guy. And that was between 1963 and like 1975, I think it closed down. Right. So he kind of has that, if it's gruff and horrible on the outside, or just, rough and not inviting, but maybe deep down, they just all gooey insides that just want to love someone.
He's so sweet. Like, he just loves it. Like, he's just so into it, like so unabashedly into the dancing and everything.
And he can deal with Adam so well. And it's just that, he can, and he definitely sees the distinction between like Adam as a drag performer and flamboyant, and Bernadette as a trans woman, because every time I watch this film I get a little bit more, and especially the past 5 years. A lot has been said about trans rights, and that's fantastic. But this movie shows this tiny little thing within the gay community wasn't always good at dealing with trans people. It didn't understand it. It's gender versus sexuality, which is why, it's really weird that they're lumped together.
Right.
When I watched it this time, the whole, queer parents and the wonderful children that they'll have, this fear that they'll raise these little horrors of, and yes, there was like the one very heavy-handed part that like like a lesbian mom can raise the most delightful boy. But come on, it was 1994 and
come on.
Game Boys hadn't been invented yet. Well, he hadn't got one yet. So let's see how nice he would be in like a year with Pokemon cards as well. Just add it. But I did like it. I did like the parenting angle and about aging and all that kind of stuff, and him trying to schlock his drag Avon.
I know. Well, that's the thing. You go into this movie expecting it to be silly and campy, and then you deal with issues that you wouldn't expect to see, like aging, like parenting, like all these deeper issues that you wouldn't have expected from this kind of a movie. Which is what helps it rise above that kind of movie.
But can anyone else think of a movie that makes a joke about child molestation by the person that was molested?
Right? Yeah.
No. Only in this.
Right.
But it was just like, and it was like his mum was playing golf, so he was like stuck in the bath for 7 hours, and he was like, and I thought they were small and wrinkly before.
Yeah, that whole scene is so uncomfortably bizarre to watch, because it's like you want to laugh, but you want to be like, this is so inappropriate, and you want to be like, this is awful, but it's funny, but I don't know what to think here.
No, I love the revenge that his mum was out, so the guy was left there for 7 hours, and it's just like, yeah, you should be left there for 7 hours and longer and go to jail, please.
Right.
So I have a question. Do Sydney ciders actually sound like that in the 90s? Because I swear, all of the movies set in Sydney at that time are super nasally, like have really nasally Australian accents, but Priscilla seems to be worse than usual. But
I don't know.
With Adam, it is an affectation that he uses.
It's part of his character, yeah. But like it's super nasally, and I'm like,
Guy Pearce is amazing in this movie.
Oh, Guy Pearce is amazing in everything. Let's be honest.
He just completely becomes that character.
Yep.
And he was cast at the 11th hour, and Terrence Stamp and Hugo Weaving had time to prepare, and yes, they're a little bit older, so they're not as fluid with the dance moves, but you just see Guy Pearce, you're like, you were born into this. Like, how? You were cast weeks before they started shooting.
He's never still. He's always moving.
I know.
Every second of the day.
Every time, I was just like, someone needs to give him some Ritalin just to see. Because it's so ADHD, and it's just always moving, always moving.
Whenever he stops, it's like the most outrageous pose. Like every limb is contorted to the nth degree.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's someone not trying to take on society's airs of respectability. I'll just do whatever I want. I'm going to move how I feel, and if you don't like it, fuck you. You were mentioning the dancing, which did make me bring up, if I had one criticism from this, it would be that whenever like all three of them were doing a performance, it felt like the background dancing was very flat, in the sense that I felt like they were very much doing 1, 2, 3, 4 in their heads. Like it wasn't smooth and natural. It was like, I have learned this routine and I'm doing step 3 now. You know what I mean? And that I thought was a little odd, because if anything, drag queens are all about realness and, making it seem natural and real. And I would have a hard time imagining these like forced dance routines that they did that were very like static, if I had any criticism of it. And that would probably be about it.
Oh, I just wanted to mention one last thing because it's 2018 now, and Stephan Elliott's movie Suburban Safari is out, and in a couple of months, Priscilla is coming to, like, the musical's coming back to Australia, but not to Perth, but to Australia. So Duncan, Melbourne, photos, please. I'll buy you tickets.
All right.
And need me those ping pong
if you buy me
balls.
tickets, I'll go.
Yes.
I'll bring a packet of ping pong balls, to throw on.
That would be awesome. Audience participation, like car,
I said throw.
That's